This is My Story to His Glory, Lester Sumrall, Chapter 3, The World Didn't Seem to Need Me. Please subscribe to the channel if you feel like giving. That's the way. Chapter 3, when I was born, our house was already full of children. There was Houston, Anna, Kimi, Ernest, Louise, and now there was Lester. I wasn't really needed, and as I grew up, I often felt this. When I started out to preach, there were literally hundreds of young men and women on the evangelistic circuit and out in the mission field of the world, and they seemed much better suited for ministry than I. This world didn't seem to need me either. When I became a missionary, it seemed that the field was overrun with workers, and I knew my lack of training and my little experience hardly qualified me for the mission field. Was I really needed? The first 18 months away from home as a young preacher boy were my introduction into the school of evangelism. And sometimes I go over to our World Harvest Bible College and observe those young men and women deep in study, and I am reminded of my own preparation. It was far different from this. Then I am overwhelmed with gratitude to the Lord and His faithful people who have helped me make this arm of our ministry possible. When I wrote my first book and offered it to Marshall, Morgan, and Scott in London, England, my friend told me there were already enough authors and books. I wasn't needed. It was only Jesus who made me feel wanted and needed. He gave assurance that I had a place among men. This place has often been challenged. There are those who would try to wrench away a man's faith and his call. A fishing buddy joined me as we left Panama City those long years ago. We headed north in his old overland car. Our faith and spirits were high as we stopped under a persimmon tree after traveling some distance and ate our fill. I didn't look like a preacher in my 92-pound of a city boy finery, but I did manage to convince farmers along the way to open up their old country schoolhouses and let us hold revival services. Most of the time we found these schoolhouses had no electricity, so we had to borrow lanterns. A meeting of any kind in the country in those days was a social event. The farmers had their wives welcomed opportunities to come together and talk about their crops and the things farmers' wives talk about. Their sons and daughters came to look at each other over. So it was sort of a social thing. But we did manage to get a congregation together. I wouldn't want you to think my preaching was so dramatic that it was causing the people to turn out. We held many open-air revivals under arbors, shelters made from branches of trees. I still marvel that the Lord could have used me at all. I stood before those farmers and their families in my white shirt and white trousers, white socks and white shoes. I didn't have a lot of love in my heart for those people. I worked hard and was faithful to my calling, but still I had a bad attitude. I wasn't as clean on the inside as I looked on the outside. At times I was brash, I was abrupt and negative. Often the response was laughter, and this irritated me. I tried to tell them the story of Lester Sumrall, living, dying, living again. Well, they just hee-hawed, and I was pretty frustrated. But I had to fulfill my obligation to God. I'd made a promise, and God spared my life. And to tell the truth, I didn't want to risk almost dying again. The next time I spoke, I decided to try a new approach. Let me tell you why I'm here. I was born in New Orleans into a half-Christian family. My mother is a Christian. My father is not. Ha, ha, ha. The laughing started again. The farmers would chew and then spit their tobacco juice and laugh at me. I was miserable, but determined to tell my story. I told them about my frequent brushes with death, the time a few years after birth when I contracted the dreaded disease pellagra. Mother's prayer group prayed for me, and God answered with a miracle. God's cure left no defects from the ravaging disease. Then there was the time at the age of 5 or 6 when my older brother, Houston, and I were playing on the railroad switching track near our home. Without warning, this brother, who was more than twice my size, lunged into me, and together we rolled off the tracks just inches ahead of the sharp steel wheels of an engineless freight car bearing down upon us. But that wasn't all. I spoke of the time a few years later when I narrowly escaped death by drowning. The normally calm waters of the Tallahala Creek were swollen by winter rains. But when I was challenged to swim across, I took the dare. My 2 stronger companions made it across, but I was no match for the swollen stream. One of the kids dived in and felt along the sandy creek bottom and found me. With a desperate struggle, he dragged me onto the bank. The poor kid didn't know anything about artificial respiration, but he just turned me over and kept punching me until the water gushed out and I gasped for air. Things were a bit more calm after that until I reached my teen years. I once flirted with death then, too, running through the streets of Mobile, Alabama at Mardi Gras at the time. A little girl in a weird costume came up and hit me, and I spun around and walloped her. The guy with her pulled out a long razor and slashed out at me, cutting through my thick sweater and shirt. Obviously, I lived to tell about it. Then I moved into the story of my more recent brush with death when I lay dying from tuberculosis. I told how God raised me up and gave me a vision, and how I promised him to be a preacher. I shared with those country folk that my mother, from my earliest remembrance, knew God and was a woman of remarkable faith, but my father wasn't the least bit religious, and in fact hated church. Mother had God and Papa had muscle, but about 200 pounds of it. And he smoked, he drank, and he chewed, and he committed adultery. My brothers and sisters and I were fearful of this godless man. We tried to keep on his good side because he was so strong. When you got spanked by Papa, you saw stars and stripes. We kept things right with him, even if we had to tell a lie now and then to do so. When his fists hit the table, the dishes flew, and he cussed me for everything you could cuss a poor kid out for. He made threats and would slam the back door as he left home, yelling at the top of his lungs. His whippings and his tongue lashings really hurt. When Papa was especially angry, instead of calling me Lester, he would boom out with, "Boy." And that was warning enough for me. Early in life, I discerned the dissension in my family. Mother's religious, I decided, and if I want to go that way, I have to be good. But Papa is a sinner. If I want to go that way, I can do whatever I want to do. I decided to go Papa's way. But I had not taken into account Mother and her friends from the ladies' prayer group. Mother kept all her children clean and well-dressed and well-fed in church and in line. She never sought for Papa's assistance in discipline. Since I was the meanest kid in the family, she whipped me more than all the others put together. At least that's the way it seemed to me. Once she even threatened to send me to reform school. To my knowledge, she never communicated this to Papa. He was just the guy to have done it. I think that's what worried her, and that's what stopped her from suggesting it. When I was about 6 years old, there was fear in the house. We felt that our mother was going to die. An open draining cancer on her left breast kept her in constant pain. In those days, the doctors knew one thing to do about cancer. They cut it out with a knife. "I don't want to touch it," the family doctor told Papa. "We never get the roots, and it will just come back worse than ever. We'll operate only if you insist." Neither Mother nor Papa insisted. And one night, Mother walked the floor in pain and in exhaustion and fell across the bed. Then, not knowing whether it was a dream or a vision, she saw Jesus enter her room and put his finger on her chest. And when she woke up, she told my father of the dream and that the pain was gone. A few days later, my father asked her about the sore, and she checked the dressing, which was usually damp with fluid and blood, and suddenly she shrieked with amazement and joy. In the gauze lay something that looked like a baby octopus, a black core with tentacles. The cancer lay there in her hand. In the mirror, she saw new flesh and new skin, and she was healed. My mother lived another 45 years and died at the age of 87. That wasn't the only miracle of healing that I saw take place as a child. We were living in Laurel, Mississippi, when a policeman friend brought my Grandpa Chandler to us one day in the back seat of his car. Grandpa had been felled in the street by a massive stroke. My Uncle Charlie wanted to take him to the hospital, but my mother wanted to pray. Uncle Charlie did get him to the hospital, but not out of the car. The family doctor came out and said, "The hospital's overcrowded and every bed is taken." And he climbed into the car to look Grandpa over. And he climbed back out and he shook his head and said, "Take him home. There's nothing I can do for him here, and he won't live more than a few days." Mother had already moved into action and had called her ladies' prayer group, and Grandpa was so limp that the men had to tie him into a straight chair in order to carry him into the house. The ladies arrived and began praying in earnest. When these ladies prayed, the neighborhood knew about it. "What's all the racket?" one neighbor asked my sister. "Grandpa had a stroke and Mother's ladies' prayer group is praying. Jesus is going to heal him," my sister responded. "Nonsense," the neighbor said. "No," my sister insisted. "Grandpa is going to be healed." The neighbor walked back into his house, shaking his head and holding his hand to his ears, and meanwhile, Grandpa fell asleep. When he awoke, he moved his arms, and then he moved his legs. He called out to my mother, "Betty, where are my clothes?" Before any of us knew what was happening, he was out of bed, dressed himself, and the neighbor was out in his yard. When he saw my grandfather, he began to weep, and as a result of that, this neighbor came to Christ. Seeing a miracle like that doesn't always result in someone believing in Christ, but it should put the fear and love of God in one's heart. In spite of the miracles, however, my father still resisted the Lord. And so did those country folk. And as I related these things, most of them seemed to be completely unaffected by the story. Often the evening ended on a sorry note. One night I was so dejected that I didn't even try to take an offering, and I didn't ask anyone if they wanted to be saved either. The next morning the host farmer said, "Young man, if you don't work, you don't eat. If you plan to stay here any longer, you can feed the hogs." Feed the hogs? Glancing down at my clean hands and clothes, my heart sank. "Feed the hogs?" I said aloud. "Yes. Don't it say in the Bible that if you don't work, you don't eat?" "But I am working. Preaching is working." "No, it ain't," he said, and with that he shoved 2 pig pails of slop into my hands. "Go feed my pigs." What an education! As I carried those heavy buckets, the foul-smelling slop sloshed over onto my clothes and into my shoes. But more than my clothes and my shoes were affected. Oh, how my pride was injured. I was upset with God and angry at the world. I didn't know how to handle it. I lay down in the middle of the calm field, not caring if my clothes were getting dirty, and cried out, "Oh, Lord, maybe I should go home and just die. Anything, Lord, but not this." After that, I was really able to identify with the story of the prodigal son. As I lay there, humiliated and weeping, I sensed that God was trying to teach me something. "If you will be faithful to me, Lester, in the little things, I will give you much bigger things if you don't quit. I'll let you touch many people by my power, and you will yet bless multitudes. I lay there quietly weeping while the realization began to sweep over me that God hadn't deserted me. He wasn't punishing me. He was only training me to be useful to him. And after a while I got up. I picked up the empty buckets and I carried them back to the bam. I drew water from the well and washed my foul-smelling clothes, took some crude sort of bath, and began to study the Bible in earnest. I had to learn how to preach to these people, and I began to realize that I really needed that after all.